Welcome to Silent Queen's Judgment. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's get into the story. Renata Holloway's husband and his 26-year-old girlfriend were slow dancing in the warm glow of Renata's own kitchen, the one she had renovated herself, tile by tile, while Oliver stood at the island uncorking a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's grocery runs. They were laughing. Actually laughing. And Renata was standing on the back steps in her socks, locked out of her own house on a February night in Ottawa. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite. It enters you, settles into your joints like it intends to stay. She didn't panic. That was the thing about Renata Holloway. She had never once in her life panicked when it mattered. She reached into the pocket of her fleece robe and felt the familiar weight of her phone. She'd grabbed it off the counter on instinct, the same way she'd been reaching for that phone in moments of quiet crisis for the past 11 years. She looked through the frost-edged glass of the back door. Oliver was whispering something into the woman's ear. The woman, Renata had known about her for 4 months now, laughed and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. They thought they'd won something tonight. They had absolutely no idea what they'd just started. To understand why Oliver Wren's victory lap was going to be the shortest in recorded Canadian history, you needed to understand the specific and careful architecture of the lie that had been their marriage. Oliver was a senior partner at Meridian Commercial Realty, a mid-sized firm based out of downtown Ottawa. He drove a leased Audi, wore shirts that he had pressed at a dry cleaner on Spark Street, and spoke at charity dinners about work ethic and vision. He had met Renata at a fundraiser for the Ottawa Humane Society 8 years ago. She had been standing near the back of the room in a plain gray cardigan, nursing a club soda, looking entirely unimpressed by the evening. He had found her quietness attractive in the way that certain men find quiet women attractive. Not because they respect it, but because they mistake it for softness. Throughout their marriage, Oliver had been methodical about money. Not secretly criminal, not at first. Just controlling in that slow, grinding way that's hard to name while it's happening. He managed the joint account. He handled the investments. He decided when they were ready to buy the house, which house to buy, which contractor to use for the renovation. He gave Renata a household budget and reviewed her expenses with the patience of a man who believed financial oversight was a form of love. What Oliver had never once bothered to investigate, because investigating her felt beneath him, because his ego had always been his most significant liability, was what Renata actually did for a living. She had told him she worked in residential property management. She used that exact phrase, residential property management. It was accurate the way a weather forecast is accurate when it calls for precipitation during a blizzard. Technically correct. Breathtakingly incomplete. Renata's full name was Renata Holloway Price. The Price half had been her mother's family name, and her mother's family had spent 40 years quietly assembling one of the largest private property portfolios in eastern Ontario. Her uncle, Bernard Price, had started with 3 rental units in Kingston in 1979 and had never stopped buying. When Bernard died 6 years ago, he left everything to Renata, his only niece, his favorite person in the world, through a holding company structured so cleanly that most people who'd met Renata had no idea it existed. Price Property Holdings currently owned 42 residential buildings, 11 commercial properties, and a portfolio of undeveloped land across the Ottawa Valley, Gatineau, and the Kingston corridor worth, at last independent appraisal, just under $90 million. Renata managed it herself, quietly, from a home office that Oliver had never shown the slightest interest in entering. The house in Westboro, where Oliver was currently slow dancing with his girlfriend. The house with the heated floors and the custom shaker cabinetry and the back garden that backed onto the park had been purchased in cash by a Price holding subsidiary 3 years ago. Oliver had believed he was holding a joint mortgage. The monthly payments he transferred into their shared account went directly into a charitable foundation Renata had set up in her mother's name. Oliver Wren had not owned a single square foot of that house on a single day of his life. Renata stepped off the back stairs and walked across the frozen patio in her socks. The cold was extraordinary. It moved up through the stone and into her feet immediately, numbing her toes by the time she reached the gate. She let herself through into the side yard and kept walking until she got to her car, a 7-year-old Subaru Outback that Oliver had complained about constantly, said it made them look like they were still in their 20s, that they should get something that reflected where they were in life. She had never replaced it. She loved that car. And, more relevantly, That car had been registered in the name of Price Holdings since she bought it, meaning Oliver had never had any claim over it whatsoever. She got in. She closed the door and the wind stopped immediately. She sat in the darkness and the quiet for a moment, both hands in her lap, staring at the windshield fogging slightly from her breath. She had genuinely tried. That was the part that people who hadn't lived inside a marriage like hers sometimes struggled to understand. She hadn't been naive. She hadn't been oblivious. She had tried, deliberately and with full awareness, to make something real out of the relationship. She had watched Oliver's controlling tendencies carefully for years, had named them to herself honestly, had made calculated decisions about when to push back and when to let it go. She had wanted to believe that what was good about him, his ambition, his occasional real warmth, the way he'd held her hand at her Uncle Bernard's funeral, was the truer part of him. Tonight, when she had found the message thread on his laptop, left open carelessly, on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, she had finally understood that she had been wrong. Not just wrong about Oliver, but wrong about the kind of patience that was worth spending on a person. There was a message from a contact named Kay, the woman currently in her kitchen, that included a photograph of the two of them in Renata and Oliver's bedroom, taken in the mirror of Renata's own dresser. It had been sent 6 weeks ago. Renata had stood in the kitchen with Oliver's laptop in her hands and made a decision in approximately 45 seconds that she had been slowly building toward for probably 2 years. She had asked him quietly to tell her about the woman. Oliver had denied it. She had shown him the screen. He had gone cold and then vicious in that particular sequence that she recognized now as his most honest self. First fear, then cruelty. He had called her paranoid. He had called her controlling. And then he had made the spectacular miscalculation of walking her toward the back door and telling her to get some air and think about whether she really wanted to make an accusation she couldn't take back. She had landed on the back step with the door locked behind her before she'd fully registered what had happened. She sat in the Subaru and thought about that for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone. There were 2 contacts in Renata's phone that she had never shown Oliver and never mentioned. The first was her lawyer, a woman named Philippa Cross at a downtown firm that handled complex estate and property litigation. The second was a man named Desmond Fry. Desmond Fry was not a lawyer. He was not, technically, anything with a clean job title. He was a former CRA investigator who had spent 20 years inside the Canada Revenue Agency's Audit and Enforcement Division before leaving to build a private practice that served, primarily, a small number of very wealthy families who needed someone with an encyclopedic knowledge of Canadian financial regulation and an absolute absence of sentimentality about using it. Renata had retained Desmond 4 months ago, the same week she'd first suspected Oliver was being unfaithful. She had not called him in anger. She had called him the way you call a structural engineer when you notice a crack in the foundation, calmly early, because you want to know the full picture before you make any decisions. Desmond had spent 4 months compiling that picture. The call she was about to make was not a crisis call. It was the call that said, "The picture is complete, and we are ready to move." He answered on the second ring. Renata. He had the particular calm of someone who had been awake at 2 in the morning for bad news many times, and had stopped finding it remarkable. "He locked me out," she said. "I'm in the car. The woman is inside with him." A brief pause. "Are you safe?" "I'm warm. I'm fine. He didn't hurt me." "Right." She could hear him pulling up something on his end. "Are we moving tonight?" "We're moving tonight," she said. "The full package, everything we discussed, understood." Desmond's voice shifted almost imperceptibly. Not harder exactly, just more precise. "I'll contact Philippa first. She can get the emergency injunction filed within the hour given the property ownership documentation we already have staged. The house gets formally returned to Price Holdings direct title by morning, which converts him to an unlawful occupant as of tonight." "What about his accounts?" "The forensic file we've been building goes to CRA and to the Law Society simultaneously. He's been running personal expenses through his Meridian client files for at least 3 years. We have the receipts. The Law Society complaint alone will put his partnership status at Meridian in suspension, pending review. His managing partner, by the way, has been quietly looking for cause to move against him for 18 months. This will give them cause." "And the mortgage?" she asked. "The fake one?" "Philippa has documentation showing the payment history going back to the original purchase. Every transfer he made goes into evidence as voluntary payments to a trust he had no legal claim over." That actually works in your favor. It demonstrates a pattern of him operating under false assumptions he never bothered to verify. Desmond paused, which is, honestly, the most accurate description of Oliver Wren I've encountered in 4 months of looking at his life. Renata almost smiled. Almost. One more thing, she said. The woman, her name is Kira Standish. She works at Meridian. Compliance Department. I know, Desmond said. She countersigned 3 of the expense reports we flagged. Whether she did it knowingly or because Oliver told her it was standard procedure, I can't say yet. But her name is in the file. I don't want her harmed if she was just trusting him, Renata said. She paused. But I want her to understand what she was in the middle of. That tends to happen naturally once the Law Society filing goes public, Desmond said. Then proceed. She looked through the windshield at the house. The kitchen light was still on, warm and gold through the frost. I want to watch from here for a while. Tell Philippa I'll be available on this number. I'll call you when the injunction is filed, Desmond said. Should be 40 minutes. Maybe less. The line ended. Renata set the phone on the passenger seat, started the engine, and turned the heat up. She pulled her knees to her chest as best she could against the steering wheel and fixed her gaze on that kitchen window. Oliver believed she was somewhere on the back steps, cold and humiliated, reconsidering the consequences of challenging him. She had spent 6 years carefully maintaining that impression of herself. Quiet, domestic, slightly overwhelmed by anything financial, deeply grateful for his management of their shared life. She had done it originally to protect herself and the prize portfolio from the attention of someone she wasn't certain she could trust. And then she had kept doing it, long after she'd understood what he was, because she was watching, and because she was building a file, and because when Renata Holloway Price finally moved against something, she moved completely. Inside the house, Oliver opened a second bottle of wine. He was not, if he was honest with himself, feeling entirely comfortable. He had expected Renata to come back to the door by now. She would have been out there for 20 minutes in February, in socks, and he had assumed she would knock within 10. The fact that she hadn't was a small, cold thread of unease running under his satisfaction. He went to the front window and looked out. The street was quiet. The Subaru was still in the driveway, exhaust curling faintly from the tailpipe. So she hadn't left. She was sitting in the car. He told himself this was good. Let her sit there. Let her understand that the dynamic of this household was not negotiable. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A notification from his banking app. He opened it without particular urgency and then stood very still. The notification read, "Account access suspended. Please contact your branch. Reference, CR External, Review File 2024 or R114. Oliver stared at the screen. He opened the app itself. The login loaded, but his account summary was gone, replaced by a plain white page with a lock icon and a toll-free number. He tried his investment account. Same screen. He tried the credit card app. Card temporarily suspended pending review. "What is it?" Kira asked from across the kitchen island, watching his face. "Nothing," he said, which was the word he used when he needed time to construct a different answer. He moved to the living room and sat down heavily on the couch. He opened his work email on his phone. There was a message from the managing partner of Meridian, sent 47 minutes ago. 11:30 at night, with the subject line, "Urgent. Leave of absence pending internal review." He opened it. The language was formal and precise. There had been an audit of his client expense files. He was asked to surrender his building access card, refrain from contacting clients, and present himself at a meeting with the managing partner and legal counsel on Monday morning. The cold thread of unease became something more significant. Oliver was a man who had built his professional identity on the management of perception. He knew, in a way he had never needed to examine directly, that the version of himself he presented to the world was dependent on a set of conditions that could theoretically be disrupted. He had never seriously believed they would be. He was not sloppy. He was not careless. Except that he had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, which was the kind of thing a careful man did not do. And his wife had been standing alone at that counter for roughly 11 minutes before he came downstairs. He stood up and walked back to the window. The Subaru was still there. The exhaust was still coming. He thought about Renata with her club soda at the fundraiser, standing in the back of the room. He thought about the way she had looked around that house, the first time he'd taken her through it, touching the kitchen counter with her palm, as though she were assessing something. He thought about the home office she kept locked and never discussed. He opened a new tab on his phone and typed Price Property Holdings Ottawa into the search bar. The first result was a corporate registry entry. He clicked it. Listed as the sole director and owner of Price Property Holdings, Inc. Renata Marion Holloway Price. He scrolled down. The registered assets were partially listed in a secondary filing, linked to the register page. He clicked that too. 42 residential properties. 11 commercial. Land parcels in Renfrew County, Frontenac, Gatineau. Oliver sat back down on the couch. His mouth was dry. The wine glass in his hand felt like a prop from someone else's life. Oliver Kira had come into the living room. She was holding her own phone. Her face had changed. I just got an email from the Law Society. There's a complaint filed against you. It names me as a witness. She paused. It also says my employee file at Meridian has been flagged for review. Oliver looked up at her. What did you do? She said. Her voice was very quiet and entirely different from the voice she'd been using all evening. I didn't. What did you do? She said again louder. He didn't have an answer. Not one that worked. Renata's phone rang at 12:47. It was Philippa Cross. The injunction is filed and granted, Philippa said, her tone carrying the specific brisk warmth of someone who enjoyed doing their job well at unusual hours. The property formally reverts to Price Holdings' direct control as of midnight. I've engaged a licensed bailiff service. They're on their way to the Westboro address now. Standard notice and removal. You're listed as the property owner and authorized contact. How long until they arrive? 20 minutes, maybe 25. They'll knock and present the documentation. He has 1 hour to gather personal items and vacate. Anything purchased with joint funds stays until the civil division of assets is resolved. Thank you, Philippa. Get somewhere warm soon, Philippa said. You can call me in the morning. Renata put the phone down. She looked at the house. The kitchen light was still on, but the living room had gone dark. They'd moved somewhere else in the house, or they'd turned the lights off, or something had already started shifting inside. She didn't know, and she didn't need to. She thought about the evening when she'd first called Desmond, sitting at this same kitchen table, writing down in a legal notepad everything she'd noticed over the previous weeks. The cell phone he'd started putting face down on tables. The unexplained conference stays that ran a night longer than scheduled. The way he'd started treating her financial questions with a new impatience that told her he was afraid of what she might look at if she got curious. She had been afraid, too, in those early weeks. Not of leaving. She had never been financially dependent on Oliver in any meaningful sense, and she had always known that. She had been afraid of what it meant about her own judgment. She had chosen him. She had stayed. She had kept choosing, over and over, to believe in the better version of him that appeared just often enough to feel real. That version was a performance. She understood that now. The thing about being the kind of woman the world underestimates is that you spend a great deal of time watching. You observe the way certain people move through rooms, the assumptions they make about whose intelligence counts and whose doesn't, who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who has to prove themselves from scratch every time. Renata had been watching Oliver for 8 years. She had cataloged everything, and when the time came, that catalog became a forensic file that a former CRA investigator had spent 4 months turning into something that would follow Oliver Wren through every professional and financial institution he ever tried to walk into. She had not done it out of rage. She had done it out of the same cold, methodical care she applied to everything that mattered to her. Headlights swept across the front of the house. A gray panel van and a dark-colored SUV pulled up to the curb. 4 people got out, 2 in jackets with a bailiff service logo, 2 in plain coats who moved with the particular purposeful quiet of people who did this regularly. They walked up the front path. One of them knocked. Renata watched from the Subaru. She did not get out. She had no interest in being present for the next part. She had said everything she needed to say to Oliver in the 4 months she'd spent building a legal record of exactly what kind of man he was. The front door opened. She could see Oliver's silhouette in the doorway, the light from inside framing him. She watched him take the envelope that was extended toward him. She watched his head drop slightly as he read the first page. She thought about the back door clicking shut behind her, the cold rising through her socks, Oliver walking away through the foyer without looking back. She thought about something Bernard had told her once at his kitchen table in Kingston, the summer she was 30, and had just taken over the management of his portfolio and was terrified she would somehow undo everything he'd built. He had refilled her tea and looked at her across the table and said, "The people who think they're getting away with something always forget to look for who's keeping track. Find the person who's keeping track. and you'll find out who actually holds the cards. She had been keeping track. Kira Standish came out through the front door first, a coat thrown over her shoulders, a single bag clutched against her chest. She walked quickly toward the street without looking back at the house. She stopped at the edge of the driveway and stood in the cold, arms wrapped around herself, looking lost in the particular way of someone who has just understood. They were a character in someone else's story, and not the one they thought. Renata almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She held on to the almost, because it felt like the most honest response available. Oliver came out 10 minutes later, a duffel bag in each hand, his face arranged into the expression of a man who has not yet accepted what is happening to him. He stood on the front path and looked around the street, as though waiting for someone to arrive and tell him there had been a mistake. His eyes found the Subaru. He walked over. He stopped at the passenger side and looked in through the glass. Renata rolled the window down 4 inches. The cold came in immediately, sharp and clean. Renata. His voice was very different from the voice he'd used in the kitchen 3 hours ago. All the edges were gone. Tell me what's happening. Tell me what you want. We can talk about this. She looked at him steadily. There's nothing to talk about, Oliver. I know what I did was wrong. I know that. He exhaled and his breath fogged the air between them. But you've destroyed my career. You've taken the house. I don't have anywhere to go tonight. There are hotels on Rito, she said. Renata, you told me to go outside and think about whether I really wanted to make an accusation I couldn't take back. She kept her voice entirely level. I thought about it. I did not want to take it back. He put his hand on the edge of the window frame. His knuckles were pale from the cold. I never thought you were capable of this. I know, she said simply. That was the mistake. She pressed the button. The window rose smoothly, cutting off whatever he was going to say next, returning the interior of the car to quiet. She could see him still standing there, hands still raised slightly toward the closed glass, his breath fogging in the February air. She did not watch him walk away. She put the car in reverse, checked her mirrors, and pulled out of the driveway with the unhurried ease of a woman who had somewhere comfortable to be. The house receded in her rearview mirror. The porch light was on, left burning by the bailiff service, casting a warm gold circle on the empty front step. In an hour, Philippa had told her, the locks would be changed and the property would be formally documented under Price Holdings direct title. Renata turned onto the main road heading east. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets nearly empty. The Ottawa River visible for a moment through a gap between buildings, black and slow-moving beneath a February sky. She had not destroyed Oliver Wren out of heartbreak. She had not even done it out of anger, though she had felt both of those things at various points over the past 4 months. She had done it because what he had done, the financial manipulation, the years of careful diminishment, the theft of her trust and her time, was not the kind of thing that deserved to be absorbed quietly. And because she was, in the end, exactly the person her Uncle Bernard had raised her to be. Patient, precise, completely unsentimental when precision was required. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She called her friend Annette, who had known the full situation for months and had been waiting. Annette picked up before the second ring. Well, Annette said. It's done, Renata said. A long exhale from Annette. Are you okay? Renata thought about this for a genuine moment. The heater hummed. The road stretched ahead, orange-lit and clear. I think, she said slowly, that I'm going to be much better than okay. She drove through the quiet city, and behind her, the house on the park stood dark and still in the February cold, waiting patiently. The way everything belonging to a Price had always waited, for its owner to come home.